All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming to attend our public forum. This is our fourth public forum on the Zoning Advisory Committee and the zoning bylaw rewrite, which we are in the process of doing. How do I fix this? Is there a, am I just doing this? Okay. So I think a lot of you have probably been here before. How many people have been to one of these zoning advisories in the past? Oh, but we do have some new people. So that's great. Excellent. Yes, I would hope that you've been there. Come on in, Jackie. Sign in if you could. Did you sign in, Jackie?
Sign it, sheet right there.
Thanks. So what we're doing with our zoning bylaw, you know, we have the zoning that we've been working on. It regulates what we do with our property and the use of the property and how it develops in town. We first adopted ours, the version that we've got right now, in 1928, which is a long time ago, and we've been bolting on ever since. And so now we've got this kind of Frankenstein kind of piecemeal thing. It's very difficult to read, it's difficult to follow, it's hard to figure out what you can really do, it's even hard for staff to figure it out. So it winds up being very costly just because of the complication that's in there, and we want to take all that complication out. But it's a pretty big process to do. So that's what we've been working on now. The goal of the project, we want to simplify, modernize, and clarify our bylaws. So the whole goal is to bring it up to, 1928 to now. We want to make sure that it's clear exactly what you're doing and make it simple. So if there's extra complications in there that are not needed, it's a good time to strip those out. So we want to keep the guardrails around this so that our community character stays the same. It's really meant to just make things be easier to understand as we're going along. We want to improve that permitting process that's out there, make sure that we have an ability to do that. So our goal is to get our initial draft developed by the middle of July. And we've been working on this process for quite a while. When did we start, Jean?
September 30th.
September 30th. So we've been working on this for a few months now. We're going to get the final draft will be on the warrant for September 23rd. That's our goal right now. We're going to try and stick right to that. So, and then that would be something that we would vote on at the town meeting in November. So we have a zoning advisory committee that we put together, and we've got myself, Marcy West, I'm the chair of it. I'm representing the Board of Selectmen. We've also got David Trinello, who's here. He is from the Zoning Board of Appeals. He also is an attorney, so he's a great person to have on the board. David Tuttle is here from Cpdc, and so he's a wonderful resource to have as well. We've got Jeff Hansen, who's not here this evening. I'm actually going to be filling in on his part, so I apologize. I'll be reading his notes because
you are approaching your destination on the left.
Eric Bergstrom, who's also a resident in town, is on the board. We've got Aaron Calvo-Bapti, who has a business in town and is a member of town meeting. And George Pasufis, who's an associate member of Cpdc. So we've got a really good, rounded group of folks who are on the board. George is walking in just as I introduce him, so that's great. The other thing that we have that's really helped us out a ton is we've got Jean Delios, who has been working with us diligently and interfacing with the consultant, as well as in the back. Jesse Wilson's really been doing a huge amount of work on this as well. And, I can't tell you how many hours they've put in, late nights, all kinds of work on this. And Ralph Wilmer from our consultants is here, and so he's done a lot of work on this as well. So in terms of the project status and where we are, people are like, well, we haven't seen anything yet. How are you going to get it done? It's not going to be there. So I did want to talk a little bit about sort of the components of the bylaw and sort of where we are in this process. So in terms of like the overall authority and purpose, that's completely done. We've reviewed it. That's posted. It's out on the website for the project for people to look at. Same thing is true with the establishment of the districts and the way that's formatted. That's out there. On the definitions, that is in review, but I'll tell you, we've probably done about 90% of that review so far. So it's, although it's in review, we've done a large portion of that work. We spent a lot of months on the definitions because that's very foundational to what's in the zoning bylaws, and we want to make sure that those are good and that they're right. They're easy to read, they make sense, that kind of thing. We also, so section 4 includes a lot of the different components that people are concerned about. So accessory apartments, site plan review, PUDs, planned residential development, planned unit developments, aquifer protection, and medical marijuana. We've had a number of public forums where these topics have come up, so we've discussed them pretty extensively. We've actually gotten we've gone through one review. We've made a lot of comments and suggestions. We sent them back to the consultant. So those are about 60% done. So, we're moving along on those. Dimensional controls, where we have information that we're going to review that we haven't started yet. Parking signs and non-conforming, which we're talking about this evening. We've already done some preliminary review. It's about 50% complete, and we'll be finishing it up based on the information we get here and finalizing that. And then the administration, applicability, amendments, and adoption is really more of the kind of the record keeping, the housekeeping around it. So we haven't done that part yet, but that'll be coming. So in terms of the project timeline, I talked a little bit about this already, but we're drafting that zoning bylaw. We want to work on having a draft by July. And then we want to make sure that people have an opportunity to comment on it, to really get their, that'll be the language that's out there that's, our draft recommendation. And that'll go through the Board of Selectmen. We will have public forums and feedback in the summer, so people have an opportunity to give that feedback. There will be Cpdc hearing that starts in August, may continue into September is our guess. And then pre-town meeting. So one of the things we really want to do is make sure that we have evenings or mornings set aside, and I think we got a mix of when people were available. We want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to hear about the bylaws, hear about the primary changes, ask their final question, because once we go to town meeting, we have the vote on this, it'll be an up and down vote. So we want to make sure that people are really comfortable, that we haven't spent a year and a half on this and spent money and resources on the consultant and everything and have that be a waste of time. So we really want to make sure we want everyone to have their feedback, we just don't want it to be at the last minute. So that's the timeline. So for tonight's agenda, the three topics that we're talking about are non-conforming, signs, and off-street parking. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to David so that he can talk about the non-conforming. I've just been using the down button.
Okay. Hi, everybody. As Marcy introduced me, my name is David Tronello. I've been a resident of Wales for almost 4 years. Been the Zoning Board of Appeals emissary, if you will, to the Zoning Advisory Committee, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit tonight about the concept of non-conforming in that portion of the bylaw, near and dear to many of our hearts. We're going to talk about non-conforming uses, and when we think about non-conforming uses, we think about what comes to my mind and what's come before the Zoning Board of Appeals are home-based businesses, where somebody needs to apply for a special permit because using their residence as a business is obviously not what it was designed to do. Non-conforming structure would be a building that maybe encroaches into side yard, front yard, rear yard setbacks, for example. And a non-conforming lot, how many people know if their lot is 10,000 square feet or under? You're non-conforming. Welcome to the S15 world. So a lot of our town, just by virtue of the bylaw and the zoning change years ago, anybody who was on a 10,000 square foot lot with 80 feet of street frontage is now zoned S15 and is by bylaw, non-conforming. So that has increased the calendars of the local boards, because if you need to do anything to a non-conforming lot or non-conforming structure, just by right, anything that you do to that property is potentially non-conforming. So we're also going to talk about some concepts that we use as part of the non-conforming process. That is something that you can do as of right, which I think is self-explanatory. Without requiring any additional approval, you have the right to do that based upon your status as a property owner. Special permit, which is an application to the Cpdc or the ZBA, depending upon who the permit granting authority is. In most cases, I think you'll find a special permit and non-conforming uses come before ZBA. And then a variance, which is a very high standard, which typically applies to lots that would be considered non-conforming, because you're dealing with issues under the statutory definition of granting a variance, which would be something particular to the topography or the makeup of that lot that differentiates it from other lots that would entitle you to some relief. And so we're trying to use some handy-dandy charts and graphs to be able to illustrate those, and so those are the issues that we're going to focus on. So I added these pictures in sort of as an illustration of what things might be non-conforming. And so the picture on the left, where zoning in and of itself is trying to protect the character of the neighborhood, the character of our town. And especially when it comes to non-conforming uses, the type of things that we're asked to decide at the town level and at the board level are what things are appropriate, and what would the neighbors think, and how do we want our neighborhoods to look. And so I think we'll all agree that while it has a great looking swimming pool and the landscaping is wonderful, that building on the left would be something that we would consider a structure and a property, although very creative, we'll give it an A for effort, would not be something that we'd want somebody to come in and build next door to us. And that obviously is an extreme example meant to illustrate that we try to preserve our community aesthetic and make sure that our properties are conforming to the bylaws as we're drafting them and now redrafting them. Now the building on the right, the house on the right, is a beautiful specimen of a property, but I would also argue that that is also something that we might not want in our neighborhood going up right next to us. Beautiful front lawn, beautiful big house with columns, but in a neighborhood of capes or ranches, that might be out of the question from a lot point of view, and something that we might not want going up next to us for a number of reasons. Doesn't meet with the aesthetic, might not meet the setbacks. Certainly, it doesn't meet the 30-foot height requirement. But I put those up as two examples of sort of extremes as to things we might keep in mind as we go through this non-conforming structures, non-conforming uses, non-conforming lots. So the underlying goal of the Zoning Advisory Committee and the rewrite and the comprehensive reviews that we're doing in our Zoning Advisory Committee meetings is based on simplifying our current bylaw system. And why? Well, because we think the process, and we want to hear from you to the extent that you have opinions on it, we think that the process could be somewhat simplified in that a non-conforming use, for instance, we use the same example of the homeowner that owned a property, residential property, in the center of town, and it was used as a residence prior to the institution of a zoning of a business district in town. And so when the district was changed from residential to business, by law, that property was non-conforming because it was being used as a residence in a business district. So anything that's done to that property requires special permit review. Now, this poor homeowner came to us, and she was very nice, and she wanted to add to a deck, I think it was, an existing deck on the back of the house, and she had to come before the Zoning Board of Appeals because while the deck met all side, rear, yard setbacks, the extension of the deck even, because the use of the property itself as a residence was non-conforming, anything done to that property was also non-conforming and increasing, under the definition of the bylaw, the non-conformity. Now, that's how our bylaw reads and how our process guides us as to what we need to do in that situation, but I think we can pretty much all agree that that might have been unnecessary for something as simple as a deck, even though it met all of the side yard, rear yard, and dimensional setbacks and controls, that the bylaw imposed a burden upon a homeowner that otherwise might not be necessary. Now, there are plenty of areas, I'll argue to you, that it probably is necessary, but that might not be one. A non-conforming existing structure, but an addition, somebody that wants to put an addition on a house, the house already encroaches into setbacks, but they want to go up and add a second floor to a wing of the house or a side of the house that already encroaches into the setback. Well, because the alteration is being done to a property that is already non-conforming, even though building up doesn't necessarily increase the non-conformity, because the change is being made to a non-conforming structure, that requires a special permit. Now, aesthetically, we want to be able to act as a barometer for the community and solicit feedback from the neighborhood as to whether or not folks think that that's appropriate. You know, maybe you don't want that addition to be on that house for some reason, because it doesn't fit in with the makeup of the homes in that community. But ultimately, we are almost always confined to the bylaw to help us define what goes and what doesn't in those situations. Although we notify, the applicant notifies abutters, it's an open public hearing. Oftentimes, it's the town government and nighttime government that hears these types of appeals, that acts as the eyes and ears of the community and helps to define what the public, you know, we're given some discretion in terms of, is the proposed addition substantially more detrimental to the community as it's defined in the bylaw. So that gives us a little bit of leeway to add in what we think the community sentiment might be as well. Does it fit the makeup of the neighborhood? As we can agree, both of those properties didn't in that prior photographic example. And so non-conforming lots are something that we see an awful lot at the Zoning Board of Appeals. As people age and their homes age, they're selling the property. A savvy developer is buying the property and asking to knock the property down because it may be in need of repair, and asking to knock the property down. But as long as they don't go outside of the original footprint of that property, they typically don't have to come in for a special permit. In most cases, they're coming in for a special permit because they're changing the footprint or increasing the footprint. But if it's a non-conforming lot, like 60% of the lots almost, Gene, you'll agree, in town are now that are less than 10,000, well, less than 15,000 square feet. If the new structure on that lot, if we're just going to knock down the Cape House and put a new Cape House up on that same footprint, arguably that should not need special permit review because you're not changing necessarily what's already there. It's when you want to change what's already there in some meaningful respect that it triggers a special permit review. And then, you know, what we're going to try to propose to include in this process as part of our simplification is that applications that we might consider granting as of right, or things that we can try to streamline the bylaw to allow without going through a special permit or a variance review, have them approved at the county. Have them, you know, after appropriate review and consideration, obviously by daytime government, without having to resort to tying up nighttime government and the community, and more importantly, with having to come in and go through appeals and potentially continuances and you know, solicit feedback. And we've had to have applicants in some instances come back on several occasions because something didn't meet a requirement, or we required more information that wasn't provided at the original hearing, or we try to provide, I know many of the commissions do, we try to provide feedback at the board level to the applicant while they're there in front of us about something that they might want to change or might want to do, or something that we could suggest that might enable them to do what they want to do without having to come back. So we try to give them some options as to what they might want to do to change their plan around to make it more likely that they're going to get as close to what they want as they can. And so that's part of what this process is all about, the simplification and adding a common sense perspective while still maintaining the letter and the spirit of the bylaw, and trying to predict, and your crystal ball's as good as mine and mine's cracked, trying to predict what the community's going to feel, that the community aesthetic should be maintained at, so that we preserve our neighborhoods. And I think that's it. So I think I'm going to turn it over and I'll help Ralph. After every section that we're going to go through, we've got these questions, they're called turning point questions, that we're going to solicit feedback from you on each of the sections that we're going over. Here, Ralph, I'll help out too. And we ask you to offer your feedback using these clickers.
So some of you have been to these meetings before and probably familiar with these, but We're going to ask a few questions now, then we're going to go into another topic, and as David mentioned, we'll have a question or two after each section. So I think we have 3 questions that we're going to ask here, and just first question is, what is your experience with the non-conforming uses and structures section of the bylaw, if any? And we want you to choose one of these. So either you had no experience with it, or you were looking to demolish and rebuild the structure, you were looking to put on an addition or an alteration to your living space, or to an exterior space. You wanted to try and convert a single family to a multifamily, or you were dealing with abandoned uses or structures. So just push the button.
And you're talking about our personal experience as opposed to, say, a neighbor?
If you don't, the question I guess was designed to be personal. But if you don't have,
If you don't have personal and you.
but you've been
you have a
involved with it
neighbor-
from that other perspective, you can answer from that
Yeah.
perspective. Everyone voted? Okay, so more than half of you have not been involved with it, but those who have were involved with the addition or alteration to a living space. And then as we get into the comments and so on and so forth, I suspect that you may have some thoughts on your experience. But the next question does get to that. So for those who answered in the positive to the previous question, we'd like to get your thought on your experience with the town on non-conforming uses and structures. Did the permitting process go smoothly? Do you think that too many of the projects required a special permit? Not enough projects require a special permit? And for who haven't had a chance or a need to deal with that issue?
So if we answered the first one, we would use a 4 for this one?
Yes, presumably yes. Okay. So, no one thought that there were not enough projects requiring a special permit, but about a third of you said too many projects require a special permit, and 19% felt that the process went smoothly for you. And then the last question is looking for your feedback, to try and pick the best of these 4 choices. How can we improve upon the regulation of non-conforming lots, uses, and structures? Simplify the process, reduce fees for applications, provide more instructional materials, or do away with the process.
What do you mean by safe structural materials? Meaning that you pick up the ground wall, or what exactly do you mean?
Well, we've been talking about a variety of things. Certainly having that direct assistance from someone in town hall, but also brochures, pamphlets, information on the website. We've been talking about permitting guides and, I don't know.
Online form, checklists, things that are very user-friendly for different types of users.
So A is kind of like C too, huh?
There's a little bit of overlap.
Process may
Right.
be out there.
Seems like you say A, C goes right with A.
Yeah, but with
Not
well,
necessarily.
but with C, we could assume that the process stays exactly the same, but now you have more online help and help at the desk. So C does not necessarily imply that the process has been simplified.
That's what T
The other way around.
Yeah.
As far as the fees go, I have no experience with this, but I hear people complaining all the time about fees for things. Every time you make an application, what if you change and you go and you're told, well, you can do this, that? Do you have to submit a new application and pay a new fee each time you make some kind of a change? Or,
You mean for the same application?
yeah, is it just once that you pay for the initial application?
Yeah. And different towns do it different ways, but that's generally the way that would
I
work.
don't know what the fees are either, so I don't know, you know.
Okay, it looks like everyone has voted. And a split between simplifying the process and providing more instructional materials. And now, am I turning it back
I
to
think
Marcy?
you're turning it back to me.
Okay.
So the next section is talking about business and residential signs. And so I want to preface this by saying this doesn't have to do with the parking that's done on the roads. It doesn't have to do with parking, municipal parking lots. That's all part of the selectmen duties, and we will be having some planning on parking later on in the fall. So we're not talking about any of that. We're really talking about, you know, you build a house, how many places do you have to park? You know, you have a business, how many parking spaces do you have to go with that business, that kind of thing. So, this is not my section, so I'm reading some of the
Signs.
What?
This is signs.
Oh, this is signs, yes. This is signs, sorry. I'm talking about parking, but I mean signs.
Yeah, we know what you mean.
So on signs, yes. So on signs, you know, why do we even have regulations on signs? And, you know, people, who cares? You know, you don't need any regulations. We really do need regulations. So there's a few reasons why. There's some safety issues around signs. You want to make sure that the signs are safe. You want to make sure people aren't going to have problems in terms of as they're driving, being able to see them. You want to make sure that, you know, you've got that. The other thing is you want to make sure that they're not going to collapse, that kind of thing. So basic, you know, public safety. You want to make sure that the signs look the way that we want them to look in our community. So we don't want like gigantic neon orange flashing sign that's right in the middle of town, because we don't believe that that's the way that we want Reading's downtown to look. And so the sign bylaws are meant to allow, you know, to kind of define what we want our streetscape to look like and what we want the appearance to look like. And that it can kind of help to protect our values in our, you know, the property values in our community, and make sure that we've got what it is. The other thing we do is make sure that the lighting impacts from the signs are not going to be too adverse. So if you've got a sign and it's got a lot of side light, you want to make sure that's not going to be a problem as well. So, you know, we want to make sure that we've got really a good balance with our signs, and make sure that what we allow for allows businesses to do what they need to do to advertise their businesses and get customers. But we don't want to give them free rein to put as many signs as they feel like it, because we don't feel like that's going to give us. So it's striking that good balance so that people can have signage, reflect what their business does, attract customers, but not overwhelm the community. And so that's one of the things we want to make sure we do. And then, so we want to make sure that our standards going forward are appropriate for our town. We also want them to be simple to follow. We want them to be something we can, you know, that we can easily understand. So one of the things we've heard from some of the businesses as we've had some of these public sessions is, we don't think that it's very easy. We can't really tell what's going on. We can't really decipher exactly what you're looking for. And so this is one of the components we want to make sure that we really clarify exactly what the sign bylaws say. Review and enhance the definitions, make sure that those are really good. And make sure that we've got some graphics so that there's some pictures and examples of what's allowable, what's not allowable, to help make that very, very clear. We have, we'll make sure that it's clear in terms of what's prohibited, like what is not allowed. So what are those things that we don't, as a community, believe that we should have available? And then we want to make sure that the language is updated on the non-conforming. What it says is add some teeth here. So there's some signs that generate concern. So there tend to be signs in town that a lot of people complain about. Those are the types of things we want to make sure we can avoid, because we don't want our town complaining about all the signs. So.
Marcy, what is the process for establishing the standards? I mean, you have a government committee, you have public input perhaps, but at the end of the day, how are those standards established?
So, Jean,
Yeah, I can
you
jump
spent
in.
a lot of time
Yeah.
on the sign
A lot of
bylaws.
time.
a lot
So
of times.
basically, under zoning, what we have in this section is dimensional requirements. So if your building is how long, it's a square footage based on the length of the facade of the building. That stipulates the size. There's also a chart that talks about what type of sign you can have. So if you wanted to say, put a real estate sign, Gene Delio's Real Estate Company, and I'm selling properties throughout the town, I'm constrained by what's in the bylaw for how big that for rent or for sale sign can be with my name across it. So it goes through and prescribes dimensional standards, and then it also goes through and says by type of sign, where it could be located, how big it could be, based on a variety of different factors depending on the sign. So for example, a banner. I opened, Gene Delio's pet sitting company on Main Street, and I want to put a grand opening banner. You would think, okay, well, what's the big deal? That requires a permit, and it has to be no more than X number of square feet for a temporary banner that I want to put in front of my grand opening new business.
That's what I'm getting at, is those standards, which probably are universal, or maybe they're not, where do they come from? How are they established?
The size and so forth, I mean, this has been in the bylaw for a long time. Basically, back in 1993, there was pretty much a complete overhaul of the sign bylaw. And it became, you can only put a third of the window with window signs, and all these kind of nitpicky things about signage got defined, 20 years ago. So we've done some updates. CPDC's been actively involved in tweaking it a little bit, but this really is a comprehensive look at this portion of the bylaw as well as the whole bylaw to say, some people have said maybe we should allow businesses to have more signs, and some people said, oh no, we can't have more, they should have less. Or we've had all that public debate and discussion about electronic billboards. You remember that from about a year ago? So things come and go on signs, and depending on what's going on, we take them up. But it's a bylaw, for the most part, that was crafted about 20 years ago.
And those standards are particular to Reading.
Yes.
I know in some jurisdictions, some countries, the whole country is obliged to follow a certain
Yeah.
rule.
That would be nice, because the sign companies are really where we have the challenges. The sign companies come to our counter, and they're like, I don't know what the big deal is, I'm gonna do this. And, oh, wait a minute now, let me get the book out, oh no, that's not gonna work, or it has to be like this or like that. So,
But when you're dealing with corporate signs like CVS or McDonald's, or unfortunately, recognized Walgreens, they probably also have corporate regulations about how things are supposed to appear. They have forms and they have things that they use that are the corporate logo. Now, do you have the right to tell them how big they are?
Yes.
Okay.
I can't say, there's a fine line in there. I can't say if it's a certain logo, like we have a new business coming in with a certain logo. I can't say, oh, you can't have that. That's their logo.
Yeah.
But I can say in Reading, in our downtown, we don't allow internally illuminated signs. So those big plastic box signs with the lighting inside, we don't allow that in the downtown. You have to have some lettering with the gooseneck lamps or some other exterior illumination. So it's that kind of thing that by district we regulate.
Dave, did you have something else you wanted to add?
Well, the question about where the standards come from is the simpler answer, perhaps. Because Reading has traditionally put the sign regulations in the zoning bylaw, it follows the zoning change legal procedure, which involves a proposal from the Cpdc or an initiative from some of the other town boards, and public hearings, proposed language, and a vote before town meeting. It requires a 2/3 vote of town meeting to get the change, any change to the zoning adopted. And then it goes to the state attorney general for a review. So because the signage regulations are currently in the zoning bylaw, changes to that follow the same process. So there's the public hearings, there's discussions in the boards, and discussions on the town meeting floor.
So it really comes down to community standards. I've been in some communities that, like McDonald, they weren't allowed to have any detached signs. There's no freestanding signs allowed, they would be on the building itself. So that's because that community, that's what they wanted to do.
Let's hold off on additional discussion till we get to the end, because we will have a time for the discussion at the end, okay? So I actually think that now we got another turning point question, so people have an opportunity to kind of weigh in on this.
Okay, so now with this question about signs, we're going to ask you to pick 3 of these choices. So you'll hit your clicker 3 times, and you want to try and choose the answer that you like the best as your first answer, your second best, your second answer, and your third choice as a third click, because the numbers will be weighted. So first choice is design review in areas outside of downtown for signs. Second one is consistency across all business areas. Third one is to allow seasonal or temporary signs. Fourth is to allow more window signage. Fifth is to move the sign bylaw out of the zoning bylaw, and I just want to explain that briefly. And David Tuttle started to allude to that when he was answering the question about the process. There are 2 major differences between having the signs in the zoning bylaw, as many communities do, versus in the general bylaw, and a number of communities do that as well. First is just the process. So, sign technology changes a lot, and there may be a number of times or reasons that the town may want to revisit the sign bylaw specifically without having to get into all the other zoning stuff. If it's in the general bylaw, it doesn't require the process that David just outlined. So it's a somewhat simpler process if you amend the general bylaw as opposed to a zoning bylaw. The other major difference is that under zoning, and we were talking about this a little bit through the whole issue of non-conforming uses and structures, there's a lot of grandfather protections in zoning. Those do not apply if the signs are regulated in the general bylaw. So if there is a problem site where there's a non-conforming sign and people don't like it, the grandfather protection goes away in the general bylaw. And then the last choice is to just limit sign proliferation, regulating the number of signs that business might have and where they're placed, and are they off premises or on premises, things like that. So remember, you get 3 choices here. Okay, it looks like everyone has weighed in.
No.
So it's fairly even, although not too much support for allowing more window signage. Design review is the one that got the most votes. Moving the sign bylaw out of the zoning bylaw and having it as a general bylaw came in second place. Consistency in the regulation across all business areas for signs came in third place. And fourth was just limiting the sign proliferation across the board. So now I turn it back to Marcy to really talk about
me. To really talk about parking now. Now that I've given you the introduction to it, So as I said on the parking, this is really not related to a lot of the places that people have a lot of concerns and discussions about parking. Those will be addressed later on by the Board of Selectmen. It seems like parking is an easy issue, but like as soon as you look at it from one dimension, there's other dimensions that just make it a lot more complicated than it appears to be. So in terms of the parking and the bylaws that we have related to what's in the zoning bylaws, we want to make it user-friendly, and so we've created a table It's got the table of parking requirements, so the residential's one place, the commercial's another place, separated by type of use, and then been very clear about exactly what the requirements are, and added additional uses, so that it should be very easy, if you're doing something, go in and see what are the parking requirements that I need to have. We wanna make sure that we're modernizing and updating the standards so that they're reflecting what we have today. And then just clarify the regulations, so if there's places where it's really confusing, we just want it to be very clear exactly what we're talking about on these. And so that's really it on the parking component, and then we've got one final turning point question. So, you know, we're gonna have people vote on this, you know, what you wanna talk about first, second, or third. So as Ralph said, whatever you want to vote on talk about the most, you put as a 1. Whatever you want to talk about second, you put in a 2. Whatever's left is what we'll, and that's the order we'll discuss these in, so that everyone has a chance to vote, and we'll open it up. So I guess people can vote and let Ralph do his magic over here on the phone.
Everybody all set? Okay. I take that as, everybody would like to talk about everything.
Everyone wants to talk about everything.
But
so-
parking gets the slight nod, so I guess we can start
That's funny. Okay.
with parking. I just want to point out on the bottom of all the slides, that is the web address for the project website. So all the notes from the zoning advisory committee, all the drafts of the zoning bylaw changes will be posted there. There's a lot of information there. The current zoning bylaw is on the website and so on and so forth.
Would you read that?
Oh, the address? Yeah, it's www.vhb, that's like Victor Harry Bob, .com/Reading zoning.
And you can also get to the website by going to the town website. On the very middle, there's a box that'll say zoning update. If you click on that, you'll be able to get to a summary of the project and links to the site, so it's another way to
And
get.
there's also a place to submit comments.
Yes. All right, so we're gonna start by opening up and talking about parking. So, who wants to start on
Can
parking?
you go back to that parking slide? I think we just.
I
Zooms through us, right?
I have a comment.
Yes.
I think one of the issues in town, one thing about in the downtown is that parking is terrible, 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 terrible. And I think one of the problems is that there isn't very good signage directing people to our public parking, particularly.
So I'm gonna stop you right
Okay.
there, because that's for the parking discussion, not zoning. So we're really only focusing on zoning tonight.
Okay, sorry.
So that's why I started the program. So, sorry, I'll cut other people off too if we're
That's okay.
going off the zoning side.
If you could also
Don't
just
take it personally.
state your name before you comment, that would be
Yes,
great.
so, do you want-
Leslie Leahy.
So, other zoning questions that are related to parking? Yes.
John O'Neill. I'm not clear on what the standards are for parking. So could you just give a few words on what they are?
So, I can't, because there's not just a word. They're in the parking bylaws, they're pretty extensive, so I encourage you to go in and read them if you wanna know what they are today. The new bylaws will have a chart, it will be very easy to read. But it's not just the like, oh, it's, you know, it's not a one sentence.
Right, but what are the
So,
controversial components? I mean, at least can you say that?
I think one of
The
the main
contra-
things we're trying to get at is to have a bylaw that really reflects the types of uses that we should be thinking about for parking. Right now, we kind of have a bylaw that is a bit jumbled. So what we're calling for is more defined uses that say, if you have this type of a use, the parking standard is this. And clearly enumerating that, much like we're doing with some of the other parts of the bylaw, clarifying, as Marcy
Yeah.
said, really just making it clear and making it, easy to follow, because if you're this and you, I don't really understand where I fall in this.
So the controversy in the parking bylaws is not related to the zoning, probably. Most of the controversy is related to downtown, timing, locations, signage. We're not talking about any of that because that's not in the zoning. So that's why I'm saying, the zoning bylaws say things like, if you have a single family house, you need 2 parking spots. It's that kind of thing.
So it may not necessarily be as controversial, to use that term, as some of the other sections, but in addition to what Jean mentioned about just trying to make sure that there's a modern list of the types of uses and what the parking requirements should be, the existing parking requirements need to be updated, because our habits, the way development occurs has changed over time, and what might have been an appropriate parking standard for a supermarket in the 1970s is not appropriate now. For instance, and you've probably all seen this at a shopping mall, sometimes the minimum parking requirements are so extensive that 9 times out of 10, if not more, when you go to one of these malls, there's a sea of unused parking spaces. And maybe the only time the parking lot is filled is the day after Thanksgiving. I mean, it varies. I'm not suggesting that that's the case across the board. But we're looking to try and come up with, and there's a lot of statistics that have been generated by planners and traffic engineers, just to modernize what the standard should be for different types of uses and to make sure that those are reflected in the bylaw. Some communities have minimum parking standards. Most communities have minimum parking standards. Some have also established maximum parking standards, so that you're not paving over a huge area and then creating an environmental problem by having to collect the stormwater from an area that isn't really needed for parking. So we're looking at those kinds of things, maybe having shared parking provisions so that a dentist office and a restaurant can share a parking lot because their peak periods are different periods, so that there's more efficient use of land, things along those lines.
Yes.
Hi, Fausto Garcia. Perhaps it doesn't apply to this, but under modernizing the standards, taking care of like electric vehicle charging, or is that not part of the zoning?
That wouldn't be
Some
part of
zoning-
zoning.
Well,
Yeah.
some zoning bylaws have started to require that a certain number be assigned for electric vehicles. Some have started to, have also addressed the issue of compact parking spaces, although that's always hard to enforce, because you always see an SUV in a compact parking space. But most zoning bylaws will provide the minimum dimensions for a parking space, as well as the minimum dimensions for ADA accessible parking spaces, and the number of accessible parking spaces that should be provided for a certain size parking lot. So those are other things that are addressed in a parking bylaw, but they're fairly standard. They're not particularly controversial.
Jackie Carson, have we looked back at new development studies over the past few years to see what kind of parking assessment we can do from our new construction of our developments that have gone up to see, I'm thinking about, us as Sanborn building, what we're gonna need, what's being used as the new apartments that have gone up.
Yep.
Just
Yeah,
to
we
see.
actually, Reading Woods, where the old Addison Wesley site used to be, we went by the standard that's required under that portion of the zoning bylaw, the Gateway Smart Growth District. And the applicant actually came in and proposed more parking. And what we asked them to do was to go with a little bit of a scaled back implementation of the parking, and to maybe reserve some of that parking to see if they really needed it. Because we had suggested that it would be nicer to see green space
Right.
than all of this excess pavement, as Ralph said, you kind of get into a frenzy when you start planning for parking and think, oh, well, I need all these spaces, and as it turns out, we're seeing in developments like Reading Woods, more smaller units. And lots of people who live in those units are one-car owners. Maybe they're single-family, single-person households. We know that we're smaller households and more of them, that, we know that from our housing plan.
Parking, how we can encourage
Right.
green areas
Right.
and things like that. I was just wondering, are we doing our own internal?
We are, yeah, through site plan review with Cpdc, we really look at what's being proposed to make
It's
sure
like
there
one
isn't,
and a half or two, like.
yeah, to make sure there isn't too much. You know, it's sort of
That's
that
what I'm thinking.
Goldilocks
We
thing.
might need excess of parking during the holiday, people are visiting, but I think we can do more.
Right. And they did that at Caloreso's also.
Okay.
They had, a provision for extra parking, and they only use that, I think it's Mother's Day and one other holiday. So they actually have a chain across, a sort of crushed stone area for parking, and then they undo that, and they use that during those holidays. Friends and Family and Mother's Day, I think, are the two big days. So, yeah, it's trying to allow people some flexibility, but not go crazy with parking. Yes.
Paul Sylvester, does the zoning bylaw handle how you count how many spaces you have?
How you count them?
For example, you know, you've said that the selectmen are involved with certain areas of parking downtown, but in the permitting process, I believe, you know, certain businesses have to have X number of spaces. Those spaces may be dedicated spaces that actually belong to the property, and some of those spaces may be in a nearby municipal lot or whatever.
Okay.
And I assume that that is in the zoning bylaws, correct?
Yes, there's a provision that says if you're within 300 feet of a municipal lot, and by municipal, I mean a public parking lot, not the town hall lot, not the fire station lot.
Right.
Not the senior center lot. Municipal.
Are we looking at that to, I mean, one of the things it seems to me is that, that allows every business in the world to basically claim the same municipal spaces in a sense. You know, they're close to a municipal lot or whatever else, and the fact of the matter is, a municipal lot that, you know, can serve 3 businesses, probably isn't gonna cut it when you wanna bring in a 4th and a 5th, and I'm not sure how to codify that.
That's getting into that area of the parking study that we're talking about. So that gets into those really complicated discussions.
But it is part of,
So it's
you know,
part of
the
zoning
zoning.
now, but we're not gonna try and solve it in this zoning bylaw rewrite because it's a bigger issue than we're gonna be able to tackle in this.
okay,
George?
So we have discussed this a little bit, Marcy is going to tell me something in a few seconds, but all I'm saying is that we are considering having some, we're discussing different regulations for businesses in downtown, and it's still unresolved. So if you have to have 3 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet for every commercial district, well, maybe the downtown is different, and we're just thinking how to quantify that. But because it involves on-street parking and municipal laws that Board of Selectmen. Now going back to the question about the electric vehicles or land banking, extra space that might be needed, but not, basically doing an environmentally good thing. An open question I have for all of us is, do we want to specify in the bylaw at some point that these applicants will have some sort of relief, as opposed to leave it to staff or committees to discover it on the fly and meter it in some sense? Do we want to spell it out as part of the purpose of doing the right thing, obviously state it the right way, but do we want to encourage or give some sort of relief from these minimum standards? That's an open question, because I think we're doing it, and we have trouble doing it in the downtown smart growth district. We did do it with shared parking, but that's an overlay district, so it's a question.
We do have a provision in the parking bylaw currently for shared parking as well. Because, you know, we looked at that and we said, you know, in some cases that might be of use to someone who really can't get it on the site. But if through this arrangement, you know, there's an ability to work with a bank that doesn't use it at night and a restaurant that needs it at night, and if you can provide it in the bank lot and the arrangement is there, it works.
No, someone answered, it was more of a zoning question about, if there's, you know, municipal lots and then there's town lots, and how does that work with zoning, say town hall's closed on Fridays? Is that then able to be used for public parking?
Under zoning, no.
No, so that's, okay.
Under zoning,
That's
no.
under
In fact,
zoning,
we
okay.
specifically clarified that because we had an applicant who was going to the zoning board of appeals and to Cpdc and saying, oh, we're just gonna park in the town hall parking lot. And so we clarified that in the zoning, that really the, whether it's the police station or the fire station or the town hall, that's really not what we mean by municipal
Okay.
lots. Now, do people park there on a Friday?
I'm sure.
That's just not under zoning.
So, are additional questions on parking?
Yeah, Bruce McKenzie. Would this include, would the zoning cover the layout of the parking or safety? For example, some parking lots have a dedicated pedestrian, pathway between rows of cars. Does that come under zoning?
I'm gonna turn over to Dave.
And I'm not sure if you got your question properly answered. There's a lot of information that we fall back on from the traffic engineering studies, from trip generation studies. There are, I'm not sure exactly who is the source of them, George would know for sure. But it comes down to the type of a business and the operating hours tend to describe the amount of trip generation, if you will, the number of cars coming and going. And it's are regulated on the basis of square footage. If you got 1,000 square foot retail, there's a number saying that this is your expected trip generation. And there's a separate set of regulations that we don't override, which specifies how many handicap spaces you need based on the number of spaces you have, or whether you need a loading zone. And it's all, part of the chart, basically, is a formula based on the square footage and the type of activity, the type of use, if you will, for the commercial parking. For residential parking, it's basically per dwelling unit, per household, if you will. And it's a factor depending on the kind of housing, whether it's single family or two family or multifamily. And sometimes those numbers are varying depending on the overlay district, if we've got smart growth or if we've got a particular project.
Doesn't seem like you addressed the question, though, if I might. Could something like that, or should something be added to pedestrian?
George?
I think we're discussing two different things. Let's get rid of the small thing first. Any type of accessible space needs striping to connect that space to the entrance of the building. That's what we see sometimes in malls or places. That is state regulation. Actually, it's federal, ADA. But we have state regulations. You park your car, you unload the handicapped person, and there's a striped clear zone, which is called the accessible path of traffic, from the car to the entrance. That's not what we're discussing, I guess. We're discussing about connectivity to a public system like sidewalks, alleys, pathways within the lots. So we have looked at this in the downtown as part of the smart growth district because it makes a lot of sense. People walk in the alleys, they walk in the sidewalks, they do many things. It makes a lot of sense to connect the entrances, even if there are back entrances, like we see in the CVS lot. There are some stores which have entrances in the back. We had trouble in the South Main Street corridor because the buildings are all the way back. So connecting a sidewalk which doesn't see a lot of pedestrian traffic to the entrance is an investment for the future when we are able to zone this with the buildings closer to the street and encourage them basically to liven the street and allow for more pedestrian connectivity in that sense. But I don't think we are there yet.
Okay,
That's
we have two more big topics to discuss, and it's almost tied, so I'll take one more parking question. So I know you wanted to do a follow-up, but if there's somebody else that, is there anybody who hasn't asked a question, who has a parking question? First of all, I want to double check on that. Okay. Bruce, you can send your question in, okay? Jackie?
No, I just wanted to add, because George was talking about that, but the pervious parking, I think we can do a better with zoning and really encouraging and educating people how they can use pervious parking when they are designing for their parking, and so that we can do a better way with green, both downtown, when there's additional places where they can add parking for overuse and things like that.
So
and
educational
in
materials
buildings.
that
Yes.
help.
Yes, I think that can be done in zoning, and I think it would be accepted better than
All
other
right,
things, but we.
I'm gonna shift us to our next topic now. And the next one was non-conforming, so. I'm gonna actually, dude, I'm gonna let you come up and moderate for this one since
Great.
you know that one.
Okay, that's fine. Are there any questions that we can help answer regarding what we discussed on the non-conforming section, uses, lots, structures?
Would you go?
Back in the slides?
Back to the list of topics, please.
So I think these were sort of the bullet points. Would that be a helpful place to go? Or do you want to see the pictures of the houses again? Okay. So non-conforming uses, non-conforming structures, non-conforming lots, the process, what qualifies, what doesn't, what you'd like to see happen. You know, we all want to do things to our properties at one point or another, and so you know, some of the things that we've seen are, there are plenty of folks that come before the zoning board of appeals that have a front porch, steps leading up to their front porch and a front porch, and they want to construct a roof and a couple of columns over it to keep the snow and ice off it, to keep from slipping down the front stairs. And if that lot is non-conforming, or those that platform and those steps encroaches into the front yard setback buffer, the applicant needs to come for a special permit, to apply for a special permit, to build that roof and, you know, columns cover over their front porch. From a design standpoint, they're all pretty standard. They're not, you know, and from a neighborhood aesthetic, you know, a lot of times before a hearing, we'll drive through the neighborhood, and that's the last house in the neighborhood to have one. So, you know, so this part of the process is meant to encourage, you know, a lot of people, you don't have a chance to deal with it until you have a chance to deal with it, which is kind of a redundant way of saying you'll know it when you see it. When you have an issue, we want to make that process as user-friendly as possible, so we can eliminate some of the need for time-consuming appeals, and enable the building inspector and town staff to make those decisions after due consideration, but not having to go through the process. Any questions? Any questions about what we're changing? Yes, sir.
Yes, Fausto Garcia. I'm curious, I know, want to kind of jump over to the signing, the part of the bylaw, because we talked about lighting. But I think that can also be a problem in a residential area. You know, perhaps it might be because a non-conforming property set too close to a property line has a large porch light. You know, will the bylaw help clarify a situation like that? Or, you know, what's the recourse?
I don't necessarily think that that's covered under the signage portion, the
Well,
lighting.
we spoke about lighting in the signage.
Correct.
So I'm not saying it should be, you know, but the same thing can happen And, you know, at a residential level with, you know, a neighbor who has a large, you know, light in their backyard.
And, you know, and so part of this process, and Gene, you chime in as you
Yep.
feel you need to. I think part of this process is being a good neighbor as well. So part of this process is meant for you as neighbors to police yourselves. So if you have an issue with your neighbor's light, or your neighbors have an issue with that, knock on your neighbor's door and say, boy, that light is bright, and it shines right into my window at night, and would you consider using a lesser bulb, or turning it down, or putting a timer on it, or putting it, I'm sorry?
Motion detector.
Or doing it as a motion detector, so you still gain the protection or the security from it without it running all hours of the night, so that it's a distraction or a disruption to people in the neighborhood. So while the, you know, from a use and a nonconformity standpoint, it's generally not covered, but it's generally not a zoning issue per se, but it's sort of a nuisance and a quiet enjoyment issue. So if something that your neighbor is doing and it is interfering with your ability, and this is getting a little off topic, but interfering with your ability to enjoy your property, then it's probably worthwhile to have that conversation. It's not generally something that the town can necessarily do to regulate. Okay.
David, if
Yes,
someone's
Jack.
buying new in town, do they know they're buying into, is that any disclosure from a realtor that their home is in a non-conforming, yeah, they're
Well, as a real estate lawyer, I always encourage
curious, just.
people to educate themselves
Yeah.
as much as they can, and count on the professionals that they use as part of the process. They're realtors. Sometimes the lender has lent, you know, if they're going through a bank for a mortgage, a lender has lent in that community, knows the type of district you're moving into.
Something, you know,
But you need to educate yourself that if you're moving into the Aquifer Protection District, there are
that's what I was just
there
wondering,
are
if someone.
regulations
Would
governing
it
that.
be, is there a way that we can encourage people to think about before they buy, if they're gonna wanna put that?
Yeah, it's you know, you're making the largest investment that you're probably ever gonna make in your life, and so educating yourself before you write the check
Right.
is always a good idea. And you know, the town is a wealth of information on that. It's, you know, sometimes as easy as a phone call. Oh, you're buying there? Yeah, it's this, and this, and you need to know this, that, and that. Or walk up to the counter and ask questions. In fact, the realtors I do business with in town, or help in town, whenever they have a question, I say, just, you know, call the front desk. They'll be able to answer these questions, and I'm sure you probably get questions all the time from them.
Yeah, we are very careful to not overshare. If we don't know the answer, we're very careful to say that. You know, so, but yeah, whatever we
But
can
the
do.
information is available to
Yes.
people that is.
When people come to the counter and they have questions about a property, especially when it comes to zoning, we go right through the bylaw.
Okay.
This is where your zone is, this is what the
Right.
requirements are,
Right.
you know, so we can cover that.
It's important to note that it's part of the public record.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Scott Miller, several questions concerning nuisance and zoning. You're saying that zoning does not consider any kind of nuisance or perceived nuisance to abutting neighbors?
Boy, I use that wrong. Huh? Nuisance is sort of a legal term of art that I use to describe an answer to a specific question. But to answer your question, generally, zoning, as it relates especially to non-conforming uses and structures, builds that concept into it, if you will. So, for instance, the discretionary portion of non-conforming uses in the bylaw gives the Zoning Board of Appeals, the Cpdc, the permit granting authority, some discretion to rule out proposed uses based upon their being substantially more detrimental to the neighborhood, to the community. So there is a sort of a community aesthetic, a community belief of maintaining the makeup, if you will, of the neighborhood. So you don't have a neighborhood of new proposed McMansions coming up next to a lot of capes, unless that's the trend in that neighborhood. And of course, all the neighbors agree that that's a good thing for the neighborhood, for property values, for them if they want to do it in the future. So that's sort of a moving target in many respects, depending upon the neighborhood and depending upon the proposed application. Is that responsive at all?
That just sounds soft. I mean, when you say, I mean, you have specific regulations and codes, and what you're saying is this whole nuisance thing is left up to some subjective analysis?
No, there are.
How do you know that the offender couldn't take the Cpdc or the town to court? I mean, it just seems like an opinion on the whole nuisance thing. My question is, are there state laws that govern nuisance in terms of, in how?
Do you have an example of the kind of thing you're talking about? I'm just curious, what exactly are you talking about in terms of?
Well, for example, businesses that have located in town that have put up a lot of parking lights and have caused a massive nuisance to the abutting neighbors. And it just seemed like the town, I don't want to go off topic, but nuisance is a very, very important topic. And I believe it should be considered in the bylaw, but what I'm hearing is kind of wishy-washy. I would like to see some sort of code written in.
Well, I can jump in and talk about that. So if you're talking about lighting as it pertains to a new business coming in, that is covered under site plan review. Almost every site plan review application that we get is discussion about lighting. We ask for a lighting plan, we want to understand the lighting, we want cutoff shields on the pole lighting, we want a full analysis of, in most cases, a photometric plan that says how far is the glow going to cast. In our bylaw says you can't have light spillover from one parcel to the next. So those are the standards that we use. Cpdc goes very carefully and very detailed into what's going on with this in terms of lighting, in terms of deliveries, in terms of everything you can think of on the redevelopment of this piece of property.
When were these bylaws enacted?
That's section 4 of the zoning bylaw, site plan review.
Right, when were they enacted?
When?
Yeah. That's my question.
30 years ago?
I mean, a long time ago.
So, for example, with like the Jordan's facility, I mean, all that, you're telling me that went through all the regulatory muster? And
That was before my time, I'll say that right up front, but,
So, yes, it did.
yeah.
And there was a lot of discussion. It's an overlay district, municipal reuse of the town landfill. And yes, it went through all of the approvals. But there's no guarantee that everybody will like it. There's particular things in terms of the side of the business that faces the highway. They have more leeway than most other businesses in town because of the siting and so forth. But that entire project was reviewed and modified and reviewed again. Our current town manager was probably heavily involved in that as well. But the other thing to remember is that the state laws that allow us to do zoning have more constraints on how to phrase this properly. We can't regulate private residences to anywhere near the extent that we can regulate businesses. Now, the state provides the property rights and personal freedoms that we can't zone against. So if you're talking about a residential neighbor, you'll probably have to deal with that yourself. You know, if it's in the worst cases, you can call the police department or something like that and file a complaint. But there are parts of the zoning that we can't do because of the state laws. On the business side, we've got a very well-developed set of criteria. And we go through the reviews whenever there's the opportunity.
Yes, Mr. Town Manager.
Bob Zerlasher. David, I wonder if you could comment from ZBA's perspective, what's the mix of things you see, non-conforming use, structure, and lot? Is one much more typical than the other?
Lately, our calendar of cases has been made up of homeowners that are, or developers actually, that are coming in and looking to tear down and rebuild outside of the footprint. Still maintaining appropriate setbacks, dimensional controls, but changing the footprint or expanding the footprint from the residence that existed before.
So that's the non-conforming lot.
That's the non-conforming lot. And to some extent, a non-conforming structure, but primarily the non-conforming lot. From a non-conforming use standpoint, as I alluded to earlier, most of the applications that we see are for home-based businesses. And there's a use table that we've updated that we've added to help simplify that process. And then the non-conforming structures are primarily they run they run pretty equal to the accessory apartment applications because they run parallel. Yes, sir.
Question about enforcement. How does the town enforce the fact that somebody doesn't apply for, an exception or whatever, and if somebody does get a permit, that in fact they stuck within the limits of the permit? Because certainly that question arises when you see some of the things that you see in town.
Well, you're talking about asking for forgiveness rather than permission.
Yes.
For the most part. So I'm sure there are.
We're not real good at forgiving people.
For the most part, I'm sure there are people in town that don't ask for permission. The bylaw is set out for those that want to apply. It's at the time of application to do something different, that they apply for a permit, that they consult with the building inspector or the planning staff, that those issues are picked up for the most part. So, and I hate to pick on, there are applicants coming before the zoning board of appeals that that bought a house that had an in-law apartment in it that wasn't properly permitted. And nobody knew about that until somebody was unhappy with that homeowner and decided to inform that use was probably might need to be taken a look at. So a lot of this again goes back to what kind of a community do we want to see? Do we want to see a law-abiding community that applies for these permits and we set the guidelines up so that they're easy to follow, easy to get through, easily defined, easy to get from A to B? I think that's where we're going with this. And the non-conforming bylaw, just so you know, the zoning advisory committee and town staff don't think it's broken. We think it works fairly well. It needs some clarification. There are some conflicting areas in the bylaw, but it works well in practice. It just needs to be tweaked a little bit to simplify the process. Yes, sir.
Bill Grace, how do the laws differ between conforming and non-conforming?
The law of
provisions.
Well, a conforming lot.
You're still constrained by some standards.
You still, even if you're in a conforming lot, you can't make it non-conforming. Meaning you still have to stay within those conforming setbacks and dimensional controls. And if you're in a non-conforming lot, you can't make it more non-conforming without convincing the town that, and convincing the ZBA or the Cpdc that is not substantially more detrimental to the community But that's a tough
Well,
hurdle.
the example you used was building a little portico
Yep.
on the front porch of a non-conforming lot, but if someone did that on a conforming lot, say a 2-acre lot,
Just get a building permit, and you're good. You'll get a building permit.
Saturday night special.
Well,
Yep.
if you do it,
Sorry.
go ahead, Paul.
So, again, the changes that you're making will make it so that that non-conforming lot can indeed just go in and get a building permit in that case?
We're discussing simplifying the process so that less applicants need to go through, potentially need to go through an appeals process to a zoning board of appeal. And if a proposed change, what we're discussing, it hasn't been approved yet, but what we're discussing is if a proposed change does not, still meets all dimensional controls, setbacks, etc., that we might consider allowing that as of right, even though it's on a non-conforming lot, as long as the proposed change still doesn't make it any more non-conforming and still meets dimensional controls. Marcy?
Just to add on to that, so one of the things we said is, are there things that come before the zoning board of appeals that they always approve? Like, if they always approve them, that's not adding any value. Those are the things that we want to look at making them viable. So
Yeah, I
that's
mean,
one of
the
those.
portico issue is one.
I know, and I don't wanna, harp on that example, but it's, you indicated that there was, maybe I have the number wrong, there were 30% non-conforming in town now?
Of the lots in town,
Yeah.
there are approximately 50 to 60% of the lots in town are non-conforming lots based
For lot
upon
area.
for lot area.
See,
And
now-
frontage.
Now, I would put forth that in and of itself is an indication that there's a problem with the process. You have that many that are non-conforming. That's a huge number, a huge percentage. And so I'm glad that you are indeed looking at this. I think you need to look at it, very, very hard. I mean, I find myself, from what I'm learning tonight after being here 34 years, I think my lot is non-conforming. Yet, when we put on a relatively small addition and a deck on the back, the building permit went straight through and.
Would you
we
say
had
our
no
address was
problem.
again? Just kidding.
Yes, sir.
Bruce McKenzie. I keep wanting to say precinct 8. So in order to decrease the load and the number of special permits, decrease the load on the Board of Appeals, I'm wondering if you could have 2 categories of grandfathered lots. Now, let me explain. So is the terminology correct? We used to have S15 and then it was upgraded to S20. Do I have those terms?
S10 to S15.
S10 to S15.
Yeah, 10,000 square foot, 80,
So I'm
50
wondering if
foot
it
front.
would help you if you said a lot that is currently in S15 and doesn't meet those requirements, but used to be in S10 and did meet those, then that's a special category of being grandfathered, and a lot of applications can be handled by the staff, not the zoning board of appeals. But if there was a lot that never met either the S15 or the S10, then it has to go to the board of appeals.
There may be some value to that, certainly as part of our discussion. I think a partial answer to your question is those S10 lots are grandfathered. They're able to exist under the S15
No, but I'm saying
district,
that
so
you have 2 categories.
different categories of S10. So let's say something that was non-conforming even under the S10
Yeah.
standard be scrutinized a little bit
Right.
more than those that were between 10,000 and 15,000 square feet lot size. I think that's a fair discussion to have and something that we would consider, sure. Sure. Yes, George?
So, for me, as a member of the zoning advisory committee, I need to hear from those fathers that made that change. Because I was not here, I've heard about it, I'm a technical person, I don't wanna go to the library to dig out why that happened. But someone needs, the proponent of that change, needs to come and itemize the bullet points. We did it because of A, B, C, and D. That would help us to unlock all the effects that we have and work with the mechanisms that you're describing. Find the right formula to protect the intent of those people and what they wanted to do. Because that happened so long ago. Times have changed. For some people, preservation is more important than overbuilding. To keep the value of the home as it is built, with the character, the taste, as opposed to go to a new home, which is in steroids. And there are many people like this, especially young people who may come to live in this community. So I'm just thinking about how do we move forward? Who is the spokesperson of that change?
That's a great place to take a break and switch gears, because we promised to have you out of here by 9:30, unless there's anybody else with a burning non-conforming.
Well, I don't know if this is really, Carolyn Whiting, I don't know if this is really to do with non-conforming, but I'm hoping that this simplification won't allow a project like the one on Beacon Street, where they're building on the side of the hill.
45 Beacon?
Yeah, I mean.
That's a 40B.
So that.
40B
that's nothing to do with
bypasses
this.
all local zoning.
That's the problem.
That's a free pass.
That's the problem, right
That's
there.
a state law.
I know.
Sure.
Yeah, Bruce McKenzie again. One thing I've noticed is kind of a creeping into nonconformity. I'll give an example. Eric's Greenhouse, I'm told that was residential zone. It started as a house. They started selling flowers. I'm guessing that they may have added more and more without, a real decision to become a business. And then it comes to town meeting, and they say, oh, we surveyed the neighbors and said, which would you rather have, a nursing home or a business? Well, no, the business shouldn't have been there. It's which would you rather have, residential or nursing home? I just want to express a concern about that, creeping usage and then, assuming the status quo is correct. That's all.
Duly noted.
Okay. All right, next topic.
Signs, yes. So, a bit of-
And if you haven't had a chance to sign in, please make sure you do.
Yeah, please do sign in. if you
Get it in
haven't
the way in
already.
and the way out, either way.
So questions, comments on signs?
Yes, over is. Back to a question I had previous, the standards for signs, is safety and aesthetics.
Yep.
There are signs hanging over the sidewalk that will fall on somebody. But the aesthetics of the signs have to be dictated by some standard. I'm just wondering where those standards come from.
So, we have one set of standards for the downtown, another set for South Main Street, another set for the industrial district. And it's really based on what we've said in the master plan about the way we want to have our downtown have that New England village feel to it. So it's a little more constrained in the downtown compared to South Main Street, which is more of a commercial corridor. So it's really based more on sort of the fabric of what's going on in that district.
Because it's interesting that at the outset tonight, we spoke about some of the bylaws date to 1928. And it's 75, 80, 85 years later. And also, we're not the outer suburb that we once were. We are becoming very much of an inner suburb. And South Main Street is going to flow right into Upper Main Street seamlessly in some short period of time. So again, aesthetics come into play.
So one of the questions that was up here was consistency between districts, and really that's one of the things that was meant was should the signing, standards sort of be the same in downtown versus South Main Street. Although you can make an argument for both ways, because the people who are coming by the businesses on South Main Street are sort of coming by them in a different way than they are in our downtown. So those are the different pieces you have to weigh out, right?
You notice that in some of the newer businesses that have gone in especially, they're using what we call blade signs. So those are the projecting signs, and they're decorative and they're small, so that at the pedestrian level, it's really eye-catching. Up and down Haven Street, you can see a bunch of them. And so that's a little bit different, you know, where it's a more walkable area downtown as compared to being in a commercial corridor, whether it's Walker's Brook or South Main Street. That's really signage that appeals more to a vehicular traffic. So that's why the standards are more generous in those areas.
Yes.
Actually,
Can you say your name?
Oh, sorry. So, Tony DeRezzo, 130 John Street. I like your comment about the blade signs, because I think those show one of the problems that you have with signage is that businesses feel that they've got to put as many signs up as possible. Many of those blade signs are redundant and actually detract from the main sign of the building. I don't think they were ever intended to be a secondary. I think they were more intended to be primary, but now you've got a large sign and the blade sign. The blade sign is blocking half of your large sign.
Well, it's interesting, we worked a lot on that a couple of years ago, and what we heard from the community is businesses want to be able to have a wall sign and a blade sign. So we actually changed the zoning regarding signage in the downtown to add that in as we were seeing more smart growth, more development, more small business. That's what we heard back. Cpdc heard from the business community, and a couple of the committees in town that were actively engaged in that dialogue said, this is what they want, blade signs.
But also, to a certain extent, the wall sign is something that you see if you're in the opposite lane driving by. And the blade sign is something that you see if you're on the sidewalk walking. So that, I understand that that more is most often too many, but there's a distinctly different audience, if you will, for the traditional wall sign. Also, outside of downtown, we've got like South Main Street and the northern part of Main Street. You've got buildings which are set substantially further back from the road. And a lot of them have the sometimes conforming, sometimes non-conforming freestanding signs at the edge of their property, so that you can see them as you're driving by. And sometimes they have the sign on the building because they didn't have the freestanding sign. So it depends a lot on where the businesses are and which kind of traffic, which kind of recognition they're aiming for.
Just to give my 2 cents on that question that was asked, the commercial corridors where the car is more like on a 30 or 40 mile per hour speed. We're not talking about the boulevard where there are medians and intersections and the traffic is lower. Some communities, few communities that I know have developed specific standards for this kind of commercial corridors, not allowing our South Main Street to become like Route 1, which is a hodgepodge of everything. So, yeah, but these are very difficult to establish, and they may require change to occur while tenants change, because an owner may, a tenant may want something different than another tenant, depending on sign. So it takes a lot of thought. Perhaps this is like for something to piggyback for the future, for a subcommittee or something, to look at the specific guidelines or graphic standards for the South Main Street corridor, which is very different than our downtown, in my opinion.
But in the meantime, a certain amount of arbitrariness has to be arbitrary in a certain extent, depending upon the conditions.
Yes, I mean, we have built into the existing bylaw, there are formulas in terms of square footage and sign height and limitations and so forth. We've changed them, probably half a dozen times in the last 15 or 20 years. It's one of these, you can't satisfy everybody all the time. The standards are there. Whenever we have a chance, we apply them strictly. And when the sign has been there longer than the zoning regulations have, it's there. It owns its property.
Tony DeRosa, 130 John Street. Have you given any thought to creating buffer zones? Say anything within X number of feet of a residential area? Maybe limiting the amount of signage, the time the sign is on, or the size of the signs?
There is a provision in Business A that says a sign that's internally illuminated has to be shut off when the business closes. But like in the downtown, conversely, all these nice signs with the nice exterior lighting, the goosenecks, those can stay on.
In many cases, they're required to.
Yeah, and we've gone back and forth at Cpdc, is that the right thing, is that the wrong thing? What's nice about it is it adds life to the streetscape to see nice gooseneck lamps illuminated and, gives a little more visibility to things. Whereas a big, enormous freestanding sign with glaring white light illuminated on the inside, that sends a different message.
Yeah, Marcy, Bruce McKenzie again. I just recently learned about the, stores can have large windows and then a percentage of the windows can be covered. And I just think that's really tacky. I remember Christmas shopping when I was a kid in downtown Chicago, and the store windows were pretty. There were interesting things to look at, inside the stores. And if you plan ahead, that there'll be a big window for the purpose of getting a percentage of tacky paper with signs on the inside. I think it really detracts from the feel of the neighborhood. So.
Yeah, window signs
I try to discourage that.
We have a lot of, sort of recurring problems with that. I think the tendency is, and this is probably more education and maybe something we could work with the chamber on, and we've done some work on this with a retail consultant, to come in and say, as a retailer, when you cover your windows with prices and ads, you're not engaging the public to come into your store. I mean, that's what retail is all about, engaging and drawing customers in. And we have a lot of really good examples of how that works in town. There are a lot of businesses that do lively things with their storefronts, and you just can't help but be like, oh, that's interesting, I want to go in. That's sort of, I think, the ideal. But I think there's a tendency for people with the illuminated open signs and the flashing. We don't allow flashing signs, so we're constantly after people to pull the chain. I actually go into stores and say, just simple, just pull the chain, it'll stop flashing. Oh, thank you. And then I go back the next day and it's on. But, for the most part, I think that especially the newer businesses, they spent all this money putting these businesses in, and they want to use that storefront glass as their front window, not cover it. And I was on Haven Street the other day and saw a bunch of them that really are doing nice work with that. But there's always a few that go the opposite.
Bill Grace again, temporary signs. Is that a problem?
Temporary,
for us all?
you're talking about banners and the like?
Banners or these, metal things you stab in the ground?
Oh, those are lawn signs.
Lawn signs.
Yep. jam them right into the grass, yep.
Or you see them uptown almost.
Yeah, those, we don't allow lawn signs. We do allow A-frame signs. So those are the sandwich boards, they're, you know, kinda like that. And it's got, you know, maybe it's a chalkboard or, you know, whatever. That we allow, but that's by permit. So you have to come and get a license at the town hall.
But in the residential areas, you see a lot of lawn signs,
Not allowed.
but they're there.
They're there.
What about political signs?
Political signs we regulate also. Yes. The size, the number of days before the election they can go out,
Number of days after they have to come down.
come down.
Open house real estate signs,
We regulate those as well.
lost cats.
No, not regulated.
Now you're really making me work.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Jody Hayward. I just wanted to add something on the commercial real estate side. I will say it's very difficult when you are negotiating with tenants. Some of them are national chains. Signage is number one. They won't even sign a lease with you until they have a sign permit from the town. We understand residential is very different, but it is a criteria. I know small businesses that they want to maximize their signage. They want to know, I need to let people know where we are and where they can find us. So it is a delicate balance.
Absolutely, that absolutely is a delicate balance, because you need both, you need to make sure people know they're there, but, you know, covering the whole thing, that's obviously not what we want either, so it is a balance for sure.
Tony D'Arezzo, if I could just make a comment about commercial and national chains. Next time you drive around, take a look. You'd be surprised at the diversity of the signs, especially a Home Depot. I've seen them with, 4-foot-high monument signs. We've seen them with the huge standalone signs. It's amazing what a commercial entity will do when they want to get into a town. But they usually play a little bit of hardball because they're trying to get as much as they can.
We're very familiar with that. There's also, you can, I've got a house down in Cape Cod, and you can drive around and you can see different corporate signage all over, depending on the bylaws of where they're located. And that's reassuring, because it means that we do retain some leverage. I also grew up in a town which was home to one of the original McDonald's with the huge plastic arches. So I'm familiar on the entire range of such things.
Any final comments, questions on signs? All right, I want to thank everybody for coming. We really appreciate your feedback, your comments. We've taken all the notes, so this will all go into the information, and invite you to come. Our meetings are always open. They're all posted on the website, so those are there. And we will be working towards finalizing the last components, and as we finish reviewing them, we'll put those sections up on the website so they'll be available. Excellent, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, you